Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Black, and I just wanted to start by saying thank you to Alex for having me today, and thank you so much to the Friends of the National World War II Memorial for inviting me to speak. I'm excited to talk about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is World War II. Um, I'm not sure if we have any World War II veterans listening today, but if we do, your sacrifice, dedication, and the duty you fulfilled are very much appreciated. Like many people listening, I have family who served in the war, including my grandfather. Over my shoulder, over there, he was a Marine in the Pacific Theater, and that's him inside the cockpit of an F-4U Corsair. But now to our topic of the day, the book that I wrote, Operation Underworld. Now, the book starts with a calamitous event. There is a giant ship that is anchored on the Upper West Side of Manhattan called the Normandie. It is the second largest ship in the world. It was a French cruise liner, much like the Titanic, except even bigger. And it was procured by the U.S. when the French government fell to the Germans. And while it was in our port, we took it over. And because it was so fast and so big, the U.S. Navy thought that they could convert it to a troop-carrying ship. Well, on February 9th, 1942, barely 2 months into the war, or the U.S.'s involvement in World War II, the ship caught fire. Now, given its location on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people witnessed the ship have the entire top deck consumed by fire. You can imagine it's 1,000 feet long. The fire lit up the sky and the smoke blacked out the sun. It was crazy. And firefighters took immediate action and went to attack the fire on the ship. And there were firefighting boats in the harbor that came in and launched high arcing water onto the deck. And they were successful in putting out the fire, which was great. But there was so much water hurled on board that the ship listed dangerously to port and then capsized. It was a loss. It was a calamitous loss, and it was a very public one at that. And of course, speculation came out right away that the reason for the fire was spy activity by the Germans or Italians. Saboteurs have been rumored to be running around New York City and the waterfront for months. The FBI had been rounding them up. The Navy had been investigating them. There were also major threats out at sea. U-boats were wreaking havoc on our merchant ships. The U.S. press was having to cover up how bad the losses were. And there were even rumors that old rum runners, were rendezvousing with the Germans out at sea and providing them with essential cargo. So the Navy was tasked on defending the port of New York from these threats and investigating these threats. And after a little digging, they realized who the real power brokers were on the docks of New York City: the Mafia. The Mafia had access to unions, the ports, the rum runners. They were the rum runners. And so information obtained from the Navy secret agents who were working with the Mafia all over New York City came pouring in. And it was a collaboration that never would have happened if it had not been for an outside-the-box thinker named Lieutenant Commander Charles Radcliffe Haffenden from the Office of Naval Intelligence. Recruiting gangsters from the Mafia was quite an incredible thing, as he formed an alliance with some of the worst gangsters in the country to gain access to areas that he could not infiltrate. We're talking about people who were currently under indictment or in jail. Once the alliance had been secured, Haffenden recruited a team of specialists with varying sets of skills. But eventually, they were met with resistance, as the Mafia gangsters that Haffenden recruited were not influential enough to secure the entire waterfront. For them to gain access to where they needed to go, they needed somebody who could snap the whip on the entire underworld. Enter Charles Lucky Luciano, who was head of the Mafia Commission and otherwise known as Capo di tutti capo, boss of all bosses. With the help of Luciano, Haffenden began to take the fight to the enemy. This book, titled Operation Underworld: How the Mafia and U.S. Government Teamed Up to Win World War II. And of course, you don't win a war by just conquering the home front. You have to take the fight to the enemy, which is exactly what they did. Now, World War II has always captivated me, and It's just amazing how many stories, how much data has been compiled to try and explain to future generations the enormous, all-encompassing world calamity that it was. And it's highly satisfying to have found and be able to tell a story about an incident that not many people know anything about. And the people who do know the story have certainly never read it like this. Now, one of my favorite sayings, and it's actually the title of one of the chapters in Operation Underworld, is "The Devil's in the Details." I love attention to detail, and when you read this book, you will find that visuals and relatable moments with the characters are the norm. This is written in a narrative nonfiction style, so this is more than a recitation of facts and conclusions. I really try to bring the characters to life. It's important for me to know how a person walks, what tobacco they choose to smoke, or what their surroundings were like. And I mean that in both a visual and contextual manner. So, for example, I'm going to show a method I use to go from a 50,000 foot view of the war and the story with context and setting, and then moving to the 40,000 foot view and then on down until you're on the ground level, which is in the character's mind. And when you're talking about something like World War II, and it's so enormous, I'm going to read an example of how you go from 50,000 feet to ground level. And this is about Commander Haffenden, who's in this part is the other main character of the book, along with Lucky Luciano. Prior to the week of April 1942, 50 more Allied ships had been sunk in the Atlantic during the month of March alone. The Germans had sunk another 11 ships in the first week of April, including a handful of oil tankers. And in just a week, the U.S. had lost nearly 125 lives to drowning, burning, crushing, and many other terrifying and unfathomable ways to die at sea. And Haffenden still couldn't answer if the enemy was being aided by people on the mainland. The U.S. military was suffering horrendous losses wherever they engaged the enemy. The U.S. also had yet to go on the offensive, anywhere. The U.S. garrison at Bataan in the Philippines would fall in early April, and prisoners would begin a week-long death march. It looked like the Soviets weren't going to lose their capital, for now, but they were still suffering horrific losses and had a massive German army occupying the entire western portion of their country. President Roosevelt admitted to the press that there have been losses, but he was mum on the details. The federal government told the press that they would be censoring the information that they shared with the American public, and the press, for their part, cooperated. The only time they did report on the sunken ship was when the enemy reported it in their press. They also reported attacks like the one on Coimbra, which was an oil tanker. Coimbra had held over 450,000 gallons of fuel in its hull when it was torpedoed just 27 miles off the coast of Long Island. People who lived near the shore in the Hamptons, on the eastern end of Long Island, called the Coast Guard as they witnessed a 650-foot tall conflagration rising in the distance like a volcano that had just opened up at sea. There were very few warships to escort the tankers and merchant ships, and as much as the Royal Navy implored the U.S. Navy to invoke a convoy system, the American Navy simply didn't have enough ships. Transport ships operated independently and were sitting ducks for the first wave of Operation Drumbeat, Germany's U-boat assault on Allied shipping around American ports. The Germans were having extraordinary success, and some of their U-boat captains didn't even bother submerging when they made a kill, knowing that there would be no response from the U.S. Navy to their attacks. Haffenden knew that if the U-boats could operate on the surface with such confidence during an attack, then a resupply rendezvous also carried little risk to the enemy. The High Command was still pressuring ONI to find out who was supplying the U-boats from the mainland, and it was proving a difficult threat to combat. Haffenden had no ships or aircraft to patrol the waters, and neither did the U.S. Navy for that matter. But what he did have was a determination to establish a network of informants that could do the Navy's work for them. If he could get information about resupply missions to U-boats, then maybe he could shut them down, and the threat to U.S. coastal waters would subside, or perhaps even disappear. The thought that he could win the battle based on a single piece of intelligence was his driving force. Haffenden believed that he could tip the scales of the Battle of the Atlantic by himself, and that thought excited him. In early April 1942, as Haffenden began exploring the boundaries of total war all by himself, this thought started to grow in his mind. Now, research becomes very important in this process. As you can see, this was loaded with information and facts, in order to reveal the narrative. Now, during this process, I filled out several Freedom of Information requests with the FBI and gleaned most of the information from a previously classified investigation about Operation Underworld. And this material revealed a unique kind of mission and how intelligence resources were deployed here on the homeland. Um, so I'm going to talk about some of the characters involved in this. As I had previously mentioned, Halfenden recruited certain specialists to fulfill these missions. So there was Agent X, and he was just previously known as Agent X, and we now know that he was a civilian named Dominic Seiko, and he had run a private investigation practice for decades. He was also Commander Halfenden's best friend and most trusted advisor. During his participation in Operation Underworld, he conducted top-secret missions, all while assuming various false identities at war production plants, waterfront operations, and buildings in downtown Manhattan. Agent Y, also previously only known as Agent Y, was another civilian named Felix Seiko, and he was Dominic Seiko's younger brother, and also a friend of Commander Halfenden's. Felix Seiko was a private investigator as well, but he also had a very important special set of skills that made him invaluable to missions in downtown Manhattan. He had taught himself the art of lockpicking. Now, this book is the first revealing of their names, and another agent that was involved is Agent George, who had been previously identified, but he was an interesting character because he was basically a professional burglar who had been hired as a safecracker. But long before Operation Underworld began, he had started to use his skills for the side of good. And so as they infiltrate this area that they're basically committing, the Navy commits a burglary all by itself. I'm going to go ahead and read a section from it. They have a special saying for it. They don't call it burglary. They call it a surreptitious entry. So this reading comes from a chapter titled Surreptitious Entry, and this is what law enforcement calls it when they commit a burglary. In this case, men from the Navy have broken into a foreign consulate in downtown Manhattan. They had previously used specialists who were trained in lockpicking and safecracking, like Agent Y and Agent George, to locate valuable intelligence within the safe. Now, when the men broke in the safe, they found an envelope and they wanted to know what was inside. And they needed to open it without it looking like it had been opened. When it was mission time again, the specialists from MI6 joined Squad Number 3. The men were surprised to learn that not only was this agent British, but she was also a woman. She was in her mid-50s with an athletic build, and she was not one for conversation. Agent George wasn't impressed with her personality, but her years certainly made an impression on him, as it took 2 sailors to carry her incredible assortment of electric burners, pots, pans, and teacups. The men wondered what the hell this equipment was for. After the team had entered the consulate's office a third time, the specialist from MI6 waited patiently until Agent George had opened the safe once again. The agent from MI6 heated up water in one of her electric tea kettles, which had a long, thin spout. As the water reached a boil, the spout began to emit steam. Calmly, she brought the steam into contact with the envelope flap and began the slow process of melting the glue that held the flap down. Once a part of the flap was separated from the rest of the envelope, she moved the spout in and out of the void, but not for too long, so as to avoid damaging the contents or the envelope itself. After 30 agonizing minutes, the envelope was opened, and the men breathed a collective sigh of relief. As one of the agents photographed every word of the message, MI6's finest brought out glue to seal the envelope shut. She then resealed the envelope to look like it had never even been disturbed, and used an iron to flatten out some of the wrinkles. I think that's a pretty cool story about an agent who came out of nowhere to join their mission, and of course, being a woman, you don't hear a lot of stories about women spies in World War II. That's a good one. And then, of course, this book has stories about spies, and there's plenty of context, and given that this audience, is heavily involved in the memory and study of World War II. Of course, this book is a wonderful World War II story. So there's tons of tidbits, that you probably didn't know. And for example, I'm going to go ahead and do one more reading. How many of you knew that the Germans actually successfully landed troops on U.S. soil during World War II? So this next part is the beginning of part 2 in a chapter titled The Enemy Arrives. It was just after midnight on Saturday, June 13, 1942, when Commander Charles Halfenden and his wife, Mary, woke up to a phone call. Details were sketchy, and not much was said over the phone, But there was a report from the Riverhead outpost that enemy soldiers had landed on the Long Island coast near Montauk, and their whereabouts were unknown. Haffenden quickly got dressed, hopped in his car, and then drove the 95 miles from his home in Flushing, Queens. Haffenden had been directed to stop at the Naval Intelligence branch office in Riverhead, where a yeoman directed him to the private estate of Lieutenant Philip Dater. Dater was an ONI officer who worked out at Church Street. His East Hampton estate had been temporarily turned into a makeshift headquarters. When Haffenden arrived, the place was buzzing with activity, and most of it was centered around a lonely, young Coast Guardman named John Cullen, who sat in Dater's living room, surrounded by Navy officers, who peppered him with questions like AA guns. Haffenden got a crack at Cullen, too. He learned that Coast Guardsman Cullen had been on sentry duty as a sand pounder, and was pacing his section of Amagansett Beach when he saw four men in the dark and pointed his flashlight at them. Cullen could barely make them out, as the moon was almost non-existent, and the fog was so thick he couldn't even see his shoes. But he was able to see that the men were wearing civilian clothes, and one of them was actually in swimming shorts. When Cullen got closer, he shouted, "Who are you?" Cullen then told Haffenden that one of the mysterious men had approached him and said they were fishermen. The man was of average height, with slick back blonde hair and a long, skinny nose. He told Cullen that their boat had run aground. This was satisfying enough for Cullen, as the man had spoken like he was an American. But then one of the fishermen had slipped up and shouted something in German. The man confronting Cullen suddenly changed his tone. He asked Cullen if he had a mother and a father, and then chillingly added, "I wouldn't want to have to kill you." Cullen was shaken, as he was alone, outnumbered, and armed with only his flashlight and a flare gun. But the man didn't linger on this threat for very long, and offered Cullen $300. He asked Cullen, "Why don't you just forget about the whole thing?" Cullen accepted their money and pretended to play along. The four men then disappeared into the night, and the Coast Guardsman ran to alert his commander. Cullen's actions were under a microscope, as officers were still deciding if Cullen should be praised or keelhauled. Thank you so much again for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book. And I'd love to go ahead and take some questions from the audience if you guys have them. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How you doing?
Good. I tell us about Lucky Luciano. Give us a background on him because he's probably one of the most notorious mafia figures in U.S. history. Uh,
Yeah, certainly. Well, I mean, his biography, notorious gangster who came out of Manhattan, and at a young age was able to rise to the top ranks of the mafia, and largely known as the one who organized crime in America. The mafia was pretty disjointed outfit prior to his taking control of it, and he really unified everyone. And one of the things about Lucky Luciano that's interesting, and it plays out in Operation Underworld, is sure he's Italian and it's the Italian mafia, but he was willing to work with all races. He was willing to work with Irishmen, Jews, you name it. As long as people were into making money, he was ready to partner with them. And that really made him unique. That made him different than previous mafia leaders who were mostly just wanting to actually just deal with Sicilians. And so in 1935, he gets arrested, and Thomas Dewey, who was a special prosecutor at the time, later becomes governor of New York, successfully prosecuted him for pandering, and he was sent to jail for 30 to 50 years. And so when World War II starts, he's been in jail quite a while. And he's not the first one on the Navy's list to contact because he's in jail. And you wouldn't think that his influence would be so strong, being in prison, but, such was his influence that when he was brought aboard, he was that person who snapped the whip on the entire underworld. And so, as happened, it may have had success with the Italian mafia in New York. He didn't have success with the Irish, on the Upper West Side. And then his friend Meyer Lansky, helped with the Jewish side of it. So he was the one who really brought it all together for Operation Underworld.
I read in some source that Mayor Lansky was instrumental in getting Luciano involved in doing some kind of deal where his sentence would be commuted if he provided intelligence to the Navy. Can you tell us about that? Is that true?
Yeah, well, partially. So, these the first gangster who was really instrumental in Operation Underworld was a man named Sox Lanza. He's named Sox because he loves to sock people, punch them, and he's pretty low level soldier. But eventually, word permeates through the mafia ranks, and Meyer Lansky learns about this through Frank Costello, who was Sox Lanza's boss. Um, and yeah, Lansky suggested, we don't know if it was Lansky's idea. History says that it was probably that it was Lanza who brought it up in the first place, but Lansky was probably the one who came up with this idea to bring in Luciano. And the thing is that the investigation afterward has revealed that they were adamant there is no deal to be made. Just because you're helping, and this is with all the mafia characters who helped out with Operation Underworld, there was no getting off your indictments. There was no getting out of prison. This is your duty as Americans to help us out in this cause. And so there wasn't a deal made, but I suspect that Lansky would have been smart enough to say, hey, this is going to really look good. And it could certainly help your chances of getting out of prison. And it did in the end. It certainly did. So.
Well, the notion of a virtuous, patriotic, dutiful mafia figure seems a little bit of an oxymoron, but I guess we have to believe that there were some professional criminals that were prepared to put country above self.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's one of the dichotomies of the book that was fun to play with, But one of the things you learn pretty early on is that the mafia loved the United States. They really did love their country, and perhaps maybe they even realized that the United States had to exist in order for them to exist. So
Right.
maybe some
Oh,
mutual interest there.
so how did you come across this story? I mean, has anybody uh, written a book about this subject matter before? I mean, Operation Underworld. Were you the first to cover this?
So there was a book written called the Luciano Project back in the 70s. It's not a very good book, and it didn't get a lot of exposure. And I think maybe the reason, and I haven't looked into this too much, but it was kind of around the era where the Pentagon Papers had been released and a lot of declassified material was coming out. So I wonder if the public was a little just jaded, from all the stories they were hearing. So, for 50 years, it's been a lesser known story. Nobody's really picked it up. And I happen to be writing for a digital history magazine back in 2018. And, I wrote a story about it in a couple of days and it was published. And several years later, during the pandemic, a writer and agent found the story online and said, "Hey, this would be a great idea. Do you know much about it? Would you like to write a book about it?" And I've only been waiting my whole life to hear something like that. So I was more than happy to take on the subject. And a couple of years later, I had a book. So.
What was your big discovery, though? I mean, when you went into the archives, were you the first to look at certain files? Was there an aha moment when you thought, finally, I have something just black and white, which isn't just conjecture and myth? I mean, was there a moment when you felt you had something really tangible to base this story on?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the investigation, the Herland's investigation, which was conducted several years after Operation Underworld and after the conclusion of World War II. Um, all the material was classified for 25 years and then reclassified, and then finally it was stored in the Thomas Dewey collection at the Rochester University in New York. Now, given that I wrote this during the pandemic, every library, well, not every library, but most libraries and about every archive in the country was closed, at the time.
Yeah.
And I was like, how am I going to write this? There was 3,000 pages of testimony that I needed to get my hands on. There is a 100-page report that you can find online, but like I say, the devil's in the details. I wanted to get my hands on, the real stuff. And so over the course of a year, I had a archivist there, nice enough who worked with me and, fed me 3,000 pages worth of material. And so there were a lot of different aha moments. Like, when you take something on like this, there has to be some sort of new learning, something that the public didn't know about it, before. And so, like even getting the names of Agent Y and Agent X, those were big moments for me, and being able to even, write about who those people were, and what their contribution was to the war. That was pretty cool. And there's a lot of holes because there was a massive cover up, after the war. The Navy, found it quite embarrassing, that they had worked with the mafia during World War II. They felt like it was beneath them and damaging to their reputation. So there's a lot of material, I'm sure, that found its way into Navy incinerators, unfortunately. So.
Does that explain why, just a couple of years after the war, the usefulness of Luciano was seriously questioned? And yet in 1954, I think it was Dewey, a report that he was involved with, he actually said that Luciano had been useful. Do you think there was the embarrassment that you're talking about explain why the intelligence, so-called intelligence he provided, was disputed a couple of years after the war, and then a few more years go by, and there's an acceptance that perhaps he was useful after all? Can you clarify that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. There were rumors, after the war, even prior to the investigation. And so the way the investigation came about is pretty interesting. So Dewey and Luciano are like inextricably linked, through time. He's the one, Dewey was the one who put Luciano away. And then he was governor when Luciano was in prison. And then Dewey is the one who pardons Luciano and gets him out of prison. So the rumor was that Luciano had paid off Dewey in order to get out of prison. He had given him a bribe. And Dewey was getting really sick and tired of hearing this, everywhere. So he was the one who commissioned the investigation to figure out if, Luciano had indeed helped in World War II, because he had pardoned him on the basis that he had helped. So he, commissioned an investigation to prove it. Well, the investigation did prove it. It set out with, two questions. Did he help? What was his help? They answered those yes, and this is how he did it. I think the irony of it is that Dewey commissioned this investigation to put to bed these rumors, but when it was given to the Navy, they're like, we can't let this see the light of day, so they classified it. They made the investigation top secret for 25 years. So Dewey unfortunately died, never having cleared his name while he was alive,
So
So
specifically, how did Luciano help the US in World War II? Give us a short list of the things that he actually did do that are proven and that are in your book.
sure, sure. So one of the things I haven't talked too much about is, and I kind of alluded to it, how the Navy took the fight to the enemy, with this mafia alliance. So I've talked a bit about the home front, securing the waterfront. But what happened is in the lead up to our invasion of Sicily, Luciano's impact was really felt in the intelligence gathering, leading up to it. So um, the United States had a big advantage when taking on Italy as an enemy, because we had more Italians than anybody else in the world except for Italy. We had tons of Italian immigrants, and so when Luciano's influence, over Operation Underworld was, his word was being spread that he was involved. He wanted, Charlie would appreciate, if you help us with this. There was a massive network of informants, within New York City, Sicilians who had been booted out of the country, deported, arrested and fled. And those people were working on the docks. They were longshoremen in Brooklyn and Manhattan. They worked for the mafia, unions, and they would never talk to people. They would never talk to authority figures because they're trained in the old Padrone system. And maybe you've heard of like on the waterfront, they play deaf and dumb. They pretend they don't speak English. You're not going to talk to any authority figures. This is why the Navy had such trouble infiltrating the waterfront in the first place. So mafia cooperation was instrumental to open up that avenue for him. And so you just have a lot. It's an amazing operation to think that gathering intelligence for such a massive invasion, was being conducted in Manhattan, and you're bringing in people to tell what did the harbor look like, what was the garrison like there. They were bringing in postcards, they were bringing in books, about the area, just whatever they could find. And then finally, not necessarily Luciano's influence, but how Operation Underworld played a part in this is that, several of the specialists who were involved in Operation Underworld, fit the criteria for a special mission, once they got to Sicily, which was, to contact the populace, because they knew that, there was the German occupiers were not very welcomed by the Italians there. So if they could speak to the Italian civilians, perhaps they could turn them on the Germans, which is exactly what happened. As soon as we invaded Italy, Mussolini was toppled, and we only had to deal with the German resistance. But those soldiers came right out of Manhattan, were among the first waves of attack on Gela and Licata Beach in Sicily, and were instrumental in having the civilian population help the Allies.
Um, One of the great ironies about the Allied liberation of Sicily and Italy, and in particular Sicily, is that the mafia were in fact reinstalled in Sicily when they had been effectively eliminated by Mussolini. Mussolini saw the mafia, in particular in Sicily, Cosa Nostra, as being his primary threat to control of Sicily, and had done a very good job of destroying the mafia in Sicily. And then along come the Americans, Canadians, and British, and in that vacuum of power that existed during liberation, the mafia reasserts itself and is flourishing to this day. So what I'm trying to say is that one of the ironies of liberation of Sicily is that we reinstalled the mafia there. We gave the gift of the mafia back to the Sicilians because precisely because of people like Luciano and our reliance on any kind of figure who could help us to create order out of chaos.
Yeah.
Would I be right in saying that?
Yes. Yeah.
One of the
Definitely.
legacies of U.S. liberation of Sicily is a flourishing crime scene today.
That's right. World War II was great for the mafia.
Exactly.
No, I mean, it's true. You come in, you kick out the Germans, and they were just as organized, in the Union, or in terms of labor leadership, in Italy. So if somebody says they're the harbor master and they can run it, you're gonna you're gonna go with that guy. They filled that vacuum very well, and of course, an outfit like the mafia and most outfits, just do not relinquish power easily. And the irony of that is also that while we empowered the mafia in Italy, one of the the aftermath of Operation Underworld is that the mafia was heavily solidified within Manhattan, after their help with the Navy.
Uh, During your research, did you come across a book by Norman Lewis called Naples 44, which is he's a great travel writer, a British travel writer, and he was an intelligence officer with the British Army in Naples just after it was liberated in the
Mm.
fall of 1943. And Luciano was actually imprisoned, or rather apparently imprisoned just outside Naples, and he basically ran Naples through winter of 1943 into 1944. So here's the guy that was in prison in the US, ends up in Italy, and Luciano is running the show. He's the top gangster during our actual occupation of Naples during the war.
Yeah, I mean the story of Naples that I focus on the most was the influence of Vito Genovese.
Right, yeah,
Yeah, and he was Luciano's number two, even though the two didn't really get along. He left shortly after Luciano went to prison. He left for Italy because he was escaping a murder charge,
right, sure.
from years before, and he was very friendly with the Italian government and Mussolini. The history says that he was the drug dealer of Mussolini's what was it, his son-in-law. So he was, he was influential in the Italian government. And then the second that the Italian government fell, he switched sides, And during the liberation of Naples, he was arrested shortly after because he was, taking aid that the Allies were providing to civilians and stealing it and then selling it, on the black market. And that's a hell of a story in and of itself. This military policeman, arrests him. Nobody knows who he is. They find out who he is. They find out he's, wanted for murder back in New York, and the military policeman brings him home, and Genovese ends up killing all of the witnesses, and ends up beating the charge. So, yeah,
Well,
quite a story there.
your presentation has provoked a lot of really good questions. I'm going to go through them with a kind of quick fire approach,
Sure.
because we only have about 15 minutes left. But did you find resistance when acquiring documents from government agencies and definitely getting, yeah, was there any kind of resistance, or was it made difficult for you? Did you find it particularly difficult, or
Well,
uh,
it was only difficult because of the pandemic,
right, okay,
But anytime something like happened like that, like it where it felt like somebody was, blocking me, I was always wondering, like, is there some kind of higher power here that doesn't want me to tell this story, And like, I get asked, like, are you afraid the mafia is going to come after you? Like, there was a fear, when writing it, like, geez, is the Navy, going to embrace this? Have I embarrassed them? And it seems that they've invited me to speak plenty, so
right.
it
So we
didn't.
have another question from Jody Beck, and that's like, what did the mafia do to help protect New York? That's the question.
Yeah, okay. So uh, they did a lot. The rumor that there were spies and saboteurs in the waterfront, that they were the actual longshoremen. Because when you think about it, there were several piers in New York City that were essential for fighting the war, and most of the material that was heading over to England, if England didn't get the material that we sent to them for, 1940, 1941, they probably wouldn't have been able to survive. And so there was just a big fear that these longshoremen who were, immigrant population, maybe not loyal to America, they're handling all of the war material. They're literally taking it from the dock and putting it on the ship. And so the mafia just basically, like, if they're the foreman, if they're the union leaders, they're going to know all the people who are involved. And so, they made sure that they had the right personnel. They also they also made sure that nobody had too big of a mouth. So you probably heard the saying, "Loose lips sink ships." Well, there were lots of bars around the waterfront, and longshoremen like to blab, hey, this ship's taking off tomorrow. And that was one of the main collaborations of the Irish gangs, was that they were enforcers in that regard. Like anytime somebody ran their mouth, they would beat them up and tell them to shut up. So
Right. This actually makes me think about an entirely different issue. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but uh, can you contrast and compare the Japanese American experience in World War II, i.e., internment, etc., with the Italian American experience? I mean, surely this was a blatant case of racism here because the Japanese Americans were placed in effectively concentration camps, and yet the Italian Americans, what was their fate in terms of any kind of repression or internment? There wasn't any internment, was there? Or was
No,
there?
there wasn't. Maybe, because it
No.
wouldn't have been as easy. But Roosevelt had spoken out against I can't remember his quote, but early in the war, he had spoken out against the Italian immigrant population. And as I mentioned before, the fear was that they were loyal to their home country, not the United States. Same for the Japanese Americans. And it's just not a good idea to insult the immigrant population that's handling all of your war fighting materials. And I feel like the Italian story, at least Italian immigrants and Japanese American story, it played out in a similar way, just that there were plenty of Japanese Americans who helped fight the war. There are very
Sure.
few instances of sabotage or spies from that population, and that's the deal with the Italians as well. And
Yeah,
um,
actually, the most decorated unit from American unit in World War II is the 4-4
Pretty second,
Second
yeah. Hmm.
Infantry
And they
Regiment.
fought in Italy, right? So,
Yeah.
mhm.
And there was a reason for that, which was that, you didn't want American soldiers shooting American citizens. That would have happened in the Pacific. But um, I came across a story that might interest you, which is that there were restrictions placed on Italian Americans during World War II, and the great baseball player Joe DiMaggio, his father had a restaurant in San Francisco, and his father wasn't able to actually run his business because there was a limitation placed on Italian Americans in terms of how far they could travel from their homes. And Joe DiMaggio's father lived too far away to be able to actually turn up at his own restaurant. So there were restrictions, there were concerns about Italian Americans,
Well,
but there
that's
wasn't
ridiculous.
the
Yeah.
institutionalized, there wasn't the institutionalized, I would say, racism that the Japanese Americans suffered.
They
Um,
certainly encountered it. Yeah.
um, I have a question here. Your chapter, Hopeless Sinners, um, what was that about? Why? Someone's very interested in it. Can you tell us about the chapter that you've labeled Hopeless Sinners?
Yeah.
Does, does that
That's
refer to us Limeys during World War II, or what is that
no.
about exactly?
Well, the final chapter is called "The Hopeless Sinners," and I had debated calling it "Thomas and the Two Charlies." But basically, it's the final fate of Thomas Dewey, Charles Haffenden, and Lucky Luciano.
Right.
And the reason why I called it "Hopeless Sinners" is just because each one of them had an idea of what the outcome would be of their actions, and none of them none of them got the outcome that they wanted. They're just in their efforts, it was completely hopeless. Dewey wanted to clear his name. The investigation that he commissioned was classified. He wasn't able to do it. Luciano, he wanted to get out of prison and retake his throne in New York. He was deported to Italy. Haffenden wanted to become a big shot, maybe even a politician. He was fired, caught up in a scandal, and almost basically disavowed. So that's kind of the basis of that. That these men had high ambitions. They had hoped that Operation Underworld would have been done major things for them, but unfortunately not.
We have a really good statement from Mike, and he says Luciano Lansky, Ben Siegel, and several others were controlling influences in the organization, sometimes known as the National Crime Syndicate, a large coalition, primarily Jewish and Italian mob figures, overseeing organized crime in the US. And this is what's interesting. To what extent did their personal opposition to Nazism, assuming that they were personally opposed to Nazism, particularly in relation to Nazi anti-Semitism, influence the involvement of Jewish and Italian um, mobsters, some of whom had links, obviously, were part of the Jewish community. Was there a sense among certainly the Jewish crime community that were they aware of what was happening in Nazi Europe? I mean, did they have any knowledge of the Holocaust whatsoever? Did they help the US because they had a personal stake in the outcome of what was happening in Europe in terms of their own Jewish roots?
Mhm.
Did you come across that at all?
I did, yeah. To what extent they knew about the Holocaust, I probably not like most of us or most of the public, probably not till later. But the fact that the Nazis were anti-Semites was well known, even in the beginning. And there's a cool story with Meyer Lansky. I think it was in the mid 30s. There was a rally taking place. Oh, what's the man's name? Something Kuhn. Anyway, he was an American, and he was known as the American Hitler. And he was rallying fascism and Nazis, within Manhattan. And a judge called Lansky and told him about a rally that was going on. And so Lansky got some of his tough guys together, and they barged into the rally, throwing firecrackers and swinging baseball bats, and completely disrupted the whole thing. The American Hitler Kuhn, he was eventually arrested, and actually did time with Luciano, oddly enough. But and then there's also a story that Ben Siegel, Bugsy, hopefully you didn't hear me call him that, was actually in Europe and close to Hermann Goering at a moment, and he considered assassinating him at the time. But I don't know if that's a true story, but
Yeah, I think the guy that you're referring to is Fritz Kuhn, and
Fritz
he,
Kuhn, yeah, that's right.
arguably the US's leading Nazi during the 1930s. If you look at some of the photographs of American Nazi rallies in the US in the late 30s, it's astonishing the crowds they were drawing and the popularities in some parts of the United States for American Nazi ideology. It's
Mhm.
quite amazing.
It is.
We have a question from Wesley, and he asks, were they actually effective in identifying who was supplying the U-boats or who sabotaged the Normandy? Did you
Um,
look into that?
Yes, they were successful in finding the conclusion to that. Now, one of the things about this book is there are a couple red herrings in it, and the reason is because these men in Navy they work in counterintelligence, and counterintelligence is basically you have to investigate every threat that comes across the table and take them seriously. And so there's several of threats that don't actually come into fruition. The rum runners was conceived, and because these U-boats they were operating so close to our home ports, there was no way that they could resupply in France, come over here, shoot the torpedoes, and then go back across the Atlantic. They had to be getting supplies somewhere. Now it does turn out to be something else on the rum runners, and I won't give that away. And then in the case of the Normandy, there's rumors that it was the mafia who was were the ones who started the fire, because it ends up being the catalyst for bringing Luciano in. I think that's quite ridiculous. Two investigations after the fact revealed that it was probably just a welder who was a spark just escaped from his torch and hit a pack of life preservers and ended up causing a fire in the entire ship. And it's incredible something like that because of the national mood and feeling. Everybody just assumed it was saboteurs and spies, and the fallout from it, even though it wasn't, is quite enormous.
Um, do you think it's interesting that people haven't focused enough on what happened after liberation in Europe and what happened specifically after liberation in places like rural Sicily, Naples, etc.? Because if you think about it, you have war, you have basically famine, people starving,
Mm.
desperate populations, and in that environment, it's crime flourished. I mean, people forget how serious a condition Europe was in 1945 at the end of the war. Millions of homeless, millions in deep displaced person camps, mass poverty, hunger, very high rates of crime, rape, etc. Um, can you place the story of your book in the broader context of what happens after liberation in many parts of Europe during World War II?
Sure, sure. I mean, yeah, it seems like the communist threat, really, sucked, most of the energy, out of the room, in combating that. Um, Once the war is over, for Luciano and Halfenden, it comes very just a personal battle. Halfenden's involvement in the war almost ended in 1943. Once the home front had been won, early on in the war, and we took the fight to the enemy, he sat in a desk for a year, couldn't stand it, and he actually ended up volunteering to become a beach master for the Navy, and was involved in the landing at Iwo Jima. I should have read that part. That's a good one. But anyway, so after the war, he's just trying to stay relevant, stay big shot. It just becomes very personal for both of them. Luciano, who eventually gets deported to Italy, gets deported to a very sad situation. I mean, it's to go from Manhattan to a war-ravaged country where he's not welcome. The government didn't welcome him. The police were following him all the time. Not a good setting to have to end up in.
We have a statement from Marcia. Brownsville and Yorkville were hotbeds for German-American Bund activities, and she suggests that we all check out the book "How Jewish Gangsters Fought the Nazis" by Michael Fehlberg.
I think it's
Um,
a relatively new book, or
right.
at least a new book on the subject came out recently. Yeah.
Okay, we don't have very long left, but I wanted to ask one final question. What did this teach you about the broader issues of intelligence during World War II? I mean, was this a really good example of how we basically tried to do anything we could to find information from anywhere? What are the broader lessons from your narrative?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, one of the things that I tried very hard to do was to have the reader experience as the characters experience. So everything's chronological. We know that we know that World War II, it's a foregone conclusion that World War II is won by the Allies. We know that. But I want to put that issue in doubt as much as possible because for the characters, it was certainly not decided. And so each one of these threats that comes across Haffinden's, table, for me, like those aha moments you were talking about earlier, like every time they talked about one of those, like yes, 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 and like oh, maybe it didn't happen. There were threats of Japanese invasions from Mexico, spies, rum runners, all of it. I think it's just interesting that in the era that we live in of misinformation, and how difficult it is to discern what's going on. Um, this is a prime example of, you got information pouring in from everywhere. You're doing whatever you can to get this information, and you got to make sense of all of it. And not only that, some of this is incredible, but you still have to investigate it anyway. I thought it was pretty fascinating, to learn their method and to really learn what counterintelligence is all about. Not necessarily, finding a way to defeat the enemy, but to eliminate their threats. Especially in the homeland.
What are you working on next?
Well, okay, so I just finished what I hope will turn into a TV series. A producer contacted me and had read Operation Underworld and was like, "Hey, do you know the story of the mafia in Cuba? Because it basically is, that's where my Operation Underworld ends. Is Lucky Luciano, makes it into Havana, and then he's eventually kicked out of there too." So basically, it's Operation Underworld Part Two. So I'm hoping that ends up turning into something. So
Well, I have just one last question before we break, and I wanted to say thank you so much for being with us. It's been a delight. I noticed that you have a photograph behind you, which I don't often see in American authors' studies. You actually have someone playing the only sport that matters in the world, which is football.
yeah, that's right. I'm a Man United fan. They're not playing so well lately, but they do.
Otherwise known to our good cousins as soccer. But
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's some
how come
soccer.
you're how come you're a Man United fan? That's very impressive.
Yeah, well, I grew up when I grew up, they were fantastic teams in the 90s, that I loved. And these guys, maybe you've heard of them, Sir Bobby Charlton and George Best,
It
maybe.
rings a bell. It
Yeah.
rings a bell. Uh,
Right, right. Yeah.
I was actually born, believe it or not, I know that I don't, I look a lot older, but I was actually born in the 1966, the last time that England actually won anything in.
So it's you who's done it, huh? You're the curse, huh? Just kidding.
Well, I just wanted to, we don't already have any other questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us. It's a fascinating story. And I, in particular, wanted to thank everybody else that's been with us this morning.
It's been a pleasure.
Up